Today on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at flow in sports. What exactly is it? How often does it occur? Can an athlete control it? And how does it relate to the concept of psychological momentum? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I wanted to tackle the somewhat related concepts of flow and psychological momentum. I talked a little bit about these things and my skepticism about them back in episode 23C. But in this episode today, I want to dig a bit deeper and also present some very recent research on the topic. One of these studies will be the number one listener pick from the survey I ran a few weeks ago, titled Is Flow Really Effortless? Before digging into the topic, I wanted to mention a couple other things I have going on. First, on my vlog, which I talked about a couple episodes ago, I've started a new segment called Perception in Action News Extra. For these, I'm going to tell you about interesting things I find that are related to the topics I discuss on the podcast. So new books, websites, blogs, technology, conferences, etc. These will also include a segment I'm calling Article Rapid Fire, where I'll do quick reviews of papers I don't have time to get to here on the podcast. The second thing I wanted to mention is something I hope to start fairly soon: roundtable discussions on the podcast. The idea here is that I would invite 3 or 4 people to join me for a discussion about a particular topic, kind of like you do in a pub after a conference or meeting. I would then record them and put them out on the podcast. If you're interested in participating in one of these, please contact me. Okay, it's now time to go with the flow. As a psychological construct, flow is a relatively new idea. The term was first coined by Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in 1975. His initial definition was, quote, a deeply rewarding and optimal experience, characterized by intense focus on a specific activity to the point of becoming totally absorbed in it, and the exclusion of all other thoughts and emotions, end quote. So, there is a lot in there, and I will discuss research that has tried to unpack this definition of flow in a second. The state of flow is thought to be highly enjoyable and rewarding, the perfect intersection between peak performance and peak experience. Another thing that most people will acknowledge is that flow can be a very fleeting and elusive state that can be tricky to maintain and even harder to intentionally induce. In Csikszentmihalyi's model, the experience of flow is comprised of 5 key characteristics, of which some or all may be present for a particular athlete. These are concentration or complete focus on the task at hand, action awareness merging, in other words, feeling at one with the activity, loss of self-consciousness, a heightened sense of control over the outcome, and finally, transformation of time. In particular, things often seem to slow down. He also identified prerequisites for this experience occurring. These are a balance between the level of skill and the level of challenge. As Csikszentmihalyi states, enjoyment appears at the boundary between boredom and anxiety, where the challenges are just balanced with the person's capacity to act. The other prerequisites are clear goals for the activity being performed and unambiguous feedback about progression towards these goals. So there are the basics. What about research on flow? Again, it is a pretty new area of study, with the first studies investigating flow in elite sports occurring in the early 90s. Most of this research was highly exploratory and qualitative in nature, with a focus on 3 particular issues. 1, understanding flow as it is experienced by an elite athlete. 2, exploring the factors that might influence it, that is, facilitate it, disrupt it, and even prevent it from occurring. And finally, 3, investigating the possibility that it can be controlled or induced. For a great review of early work conducted in this area, I would highly recommend the systematic review paper by Swan and colleagues published in 2012. I like this paper because they were very clear about the inclusion criteria. Specifically, they looked at studies using elite athletes, that is Division I or higher in the US or county level or higher in the UK, and that examined one or more of the themes of experience, occurrence, or control of flow. So, first looking at the experience of flow. Which of Csikszentmihalyi's characteristics are most commonly reported by athletes? Over 80% reported it involving concentration on the task at hand, followed by action awareness at 75%. Less than 30% reported experiencing either a loss of self-consciousness or a transformation of time. One of the things that I noticed in looking at these studies, which was acknowledged by Swan and colleagues, was that in many cases the questions posed to the athletes were essentially like leading the witness, and that they were guiding them to come up with the terms rather than having them report the experience of flow on their own. Surprisingly, only one of these studies asked about the frequency of the experience. This study by Jackson in 1992 reported that about 80% of athletes, quote-unquote, did not experience flow very often. Foreshadowing a recent article I'm going to look at in a few minutes, many of the athletes interviewed disagreed with the idea that flow was effortless. Instead, they reported exerting a high degree of effort. But, critically, they enjoyed it. So maybe it's better to say that flow involves little negative strain or effort, rather than it being completely effortless. Finally, in terms of the experience of flow, an idea that some athletes mention that I find particularly intriguing is that flow might be contagious at a team level. But this has not really been studied as of yet.
Just gonna find it the same as I leave it, still in the flow, still in the flow, and I'm low to the ground.
Turning to the factors influencing flow, the conclusion made by Swan and colleagues was that this really is not well understood, because in most cases there's too much overlap between the factors which might facilitate or disrupt it and the characteristics of the experience of flow itself. So, for example, saying that a high degree of concentration induces flow, where concentration is an aspect of flow. As I will discuss in a few moments, this is also a problem which has plagued research on psychological momentum. Along with some external factors like weather, one common theme that did seem to come out was that the likelihood of achieving flow depended on the athlete's interpretation of the situation. Not surprisingly, when athletes see the anxiety they're experiencing as challenging, as opposed to threatening, they are much more likely to experience flow. Finally, in terms of controlling and manipulating flow, 66% of the athletes questioned thought this was possible through preparation, positive thinking, and reaching a state of optimal arousal. A few interventions for inducing flow have been investigated, including hypnosis, imagery, and music, but there's no real evidence of their effectiveness. Swan and colleagues also emphasized a couple issues with previous research on flow that may contribute to the lack of clarity in this area. First, it's likely that the experience of flow is different for different sports and may not be directly comparable. Second, the experience of flow is often evaluated in an interview in which the athlete chooses a situation in which they experienced it that could have been months or even years before. So, the accuracy of their recall of the situation may be questionable. To address this latter issue, Swan and colleagues conducted a study published in 2016 in which players were interviewed within 4 days after performing well in a golf tournament. The main finding was that there seemed to be two distinct states that players reported when talking about flow experiences: letting it happen and making it happen. Letting it happen involved being calm and relaxed and usually was brought on by a good performance, for example, draining a long putt. Making it happen, on the other hand, seemed to be much more effortful, as it involved a conscious recognition by the player that they needed to pick it up if they were going to win. For more details about this study, please check out my review in episode 23C. An aspect of flow that has been frequently studied, but rarely in the context of sports, is how it's related to brain activity. The initial view of this is what you might call the quiet brain hypothesis. That is, it was believed that flow was associated with hypoactivity of the prefrontal cortex. In other words, higher order brain functions recede so that the easy and effortless performance can be achieved. More recent research has challenged this view, however, as fMRI research has demonstrated increased activity in brain areas associated with a selective attention, decision-making, and goal-directed actions during periods of flow. Consistent with the idea that flow occurs when there's a match between challenge and skill level, recent studies have suggested that the relationship between flow and physiological variables might follow an inverted U pattern. That is, flow occurs where there are moderate levels of activity, not when they're very high or low. An example of this can be seen in a Pfeiffer and colleagues study in 2014, where they examined experiences of flow while performing a computer task. During this experiment, cortisol samples were taken every 15 minutes, and an inverted U relationship between flow and cortisol was found. Very similar results were also found by Tosman and colleagues, in this case when measuring heart rate variability. So, from what we've looked at so far, it can be seen that there's one question that seems to be somewhat unresolved in this area. Is flow an effortless state of letting it happen, being relaxed, almost unconscious with low activity in brain areas involved in controlling attention? Or is it a state of making it happen, where mental effort level is relatively high and the performer is attentive and challenged? If we look at quotes from famous athletes, they mostly seem to go against the idea that it is effortless. For example, Serena Williams, quote, "If you can keep playing tennis when someone is shooting a gun down the street, that's concentration and ultimately being in the flow," unquote. To address the issue of the amount of effort and attention associated with flow, Harris, Vine, and Wilson recently used a driving simulator task to directly investigate the relationship between attention and flow. The primary manipulation in this study involved creating different conditions of the match between challenge and skill level. In the study, 36 participants played the Forza 5 Xbox racing game. Training involved 10 drives of a moderately difficult racetrack with smooth corners. During the experimental phase, they then completed 3 races. One on an easy track that was a simple circle and presumably not very challenging, one on a very difficult track with a lot of sharp corners, and one on the same track they drove on in practice, which was thus presumably matched to their skill level. The performance measure was the average lap speed. During the drive, eye movements and heart rate variability were recorded. These were used as objective measures of the level of effort and attentional focus. For example, a high degree of gaze variability, that is looking all over the road, is indicative of an inefficient use of attention and lack of focus. While for heart rate variability, a lower value is indicative of more effort being devoted to the task. Flow was measured using a questionnaire called the Flow Short Scale, which essentially measures 2 factors related to flow: degree of absorption in the task and fluency of performance. For example, for absorption, participants rate on a scale of 1 to 7 how much the following statements describe their experience. I feel just the right amount of challenge, and I'm totally absorbed in what I'm doing. Comparable statements for fluency were, my thoughts, activities run fluid and smoothly, and I feel like I have everything under control. What was found? Consistent with the making it happen idea, perceived absorption in the task, attentional focus, as assessed by gaze, and objective mental effort, as assessed by heart rate variability, were all highest in the match condition. So essentially inverted U patterns for all of these variables. For perceived mental effort, fluency, and driving performance, the relationships were linear, with driving speed getting progressively slower, fluency getting lower, and perceived mental effort getting higher as course difficulty increased. So a couple takeaways from this study. First, it seems to be highly consistent with the make it happen view, in that flow seemed to involve an effortful and efficient use of attention to the task. Second, it highlights a limitation with using interviews to understand the experience of flow, in that reported mental effort is often very different than the level of effort that is actually objectively measured. Although I think this study was a great attempt to do a more rigorous quantitative analysis of flow, I do have a couple problems with it. First is a common problem in research, and that I have been guilty of myself a few times. Manipulating or measuring something simple and labeling it something more complex. What was measured in this study was absorption in the task, not the multi-factor variable of quote-unquote flow. Even more critically, what was manipulated was race course difficulty, not the skill challenge balance. To vary a quantity that is a ratio, such as skill to challenge ratio, we need to vary both parts of it. So in other words, the authors needed to vary both the difficulty of the race course and recruit participants of different skill levels to truly manipulate the skill challenge level ratio. It's also problematic to me that the match condition was just the same course that was used during training. This raises the possibility that any effects could equally be due to familiarity with the course as opposed to a match between skill level and difficulty. A final recent study of flow I wanted to mention was one conducted by Kada and colleagues and published in the journal PLOS ONE. In this study, they had participants learn a visuomotor tracking task using a mouse under conditions of perturbation, which involved rotating the axis of mouse movement. They also looked at the effect of sleep by using different nap periods and measured flow using a 10-item questionnaire. I thought this might be interesting because it's the first study I've seen that has looked at a potential relationship between flow and the rate of motor learning. But alas, they didn't really find anything. Also, it's a bit questionable whether you can really experience flow when performing a task with a computer. In Csikszentmihalyi's original concept, flow is supposed to be an enjoyable, almost euphoric state that involves performing the action for its own sake with no ulterior motives. I don't know about you, but using a computer mouse doesn't quite get my engine revving like that. Before I wrap up today's episode, I wanted to briefly touch on another construct that is often linked with flow: psychological momentum. Psychological momentum has had a lot of definitions over the years, but basically it's the idea that previous performance significantly affects subsequent performance through some change in psychological state. So, success breeds success by increasing confidence and self-efficacy, or failure leads to more failure through increased doubt and anxiety. I think this relates to flow because many of the psychological factors that are mentioned when we talk about an athlete quote-unquote having momentum are very similar to those used to describe the flow experience. As I discussed a few moments ago, Swan and colleagues found that for many athletes, the state of flow came after one or more performance successes, the letting it happen group. In terms of studying psychological momentum, there are two distinct questions we can ask. First, just in looking at performance, is it true that there is a relationship between past and future performance? For example, does making a series of shots in a basketball game increase the likelihood the next one will go in? This, of course, is the hot hand phenomenon, which I talked about back in episode 12 and in my interview with Josh Miller in episode 15C. For many years, it was believed that there was no evidence of momentum effects in terms of performance, but more recent analyses have started to challenge this. The second question we can ask is, if we do believe there are momentum effects in terms of performance, are these performance effects mediated by psychological changes? In other words, do things like self-confidence, self-efficacy, challenge threat appraisal mediate the relationship between consecutive successes? Or, relating it back to my main topic today, does performance success induce a flow state leading to more performance success? The psychological aspects of momentum have received much less attention from researchers as compared to work on the hot hand phenomenon. A good attempt at addressing this was undertaken in a nice review article by Isoahola and Dotson in 2014. In this paper, they provide a mathematical model of psychological momentum, which takes into account frequency, duration, and intensity of effects in terms of successes, and even builds in the effect of a performer's psychological state on their opponent. What I like about it is it makes predictions that can be examined statistically. For example, its main prediction is that whether one or more success leads to future successes will be statistically mediated by changes in confidence, competence, etc. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, there are not any studies that have done this type of mediation analysis. On the surface, this is not surprising because it means we can't just use archival performance data. Instead, we need to also be collecting psychological assessment data throughout the performance. For an initial attempt to try and collect both performance and psychological data, I would again recommend you check out the work of Josh Miller and Adam Sanhuaro, discussed back in episode 15C. So, in sum, for me, the concepts of flow and psychological momentum are lacking in many respects. I think there's a strong natural appeal to want them to exist. I think the idea that we can reach this state where performing well is effortless, enjoyable, and we're just in the flow is a highly attractive idea. I would almost equate it to the runner's high phenomenon. Alternatively, the idea that you're going to be constantly having to bust a gut and focusing hard to be successful doesn't sound like much fun. One of the main problems I have with these concepts is at a scientific level, I think it's much more useful to talk in terms of their well-defined component parts than their abstract wholes. Performance success increases confidence, which leads to more success. What value does bringing the term psychological momentum into this really have? For me, if these are truly unique constructs, future research needs to ensure that all of the components of the construct are really present, not just measuring one or two of them. In other words, we can't just measure perceived effort and say we're studying flow. We're studying effort. The other thing that research needs to do in the future to satisfy me is demonstrate that these psychological constructs are separable from performance itself. If performance, flow, and momentum always move hand in hand, then I don't think these constructs have much value. Okay, time to flow on out of here. But to keep the momentum going, coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, what the heck do athletes mean when they say they have a soft focus? And coming on my vlog, a look at illusions in sports. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter @ShakyWeights. And to find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
Cut you quick.